Shabbat Shalom. We have towards the end of the parasha a kind of confusing and disturbing incident where Jacob has at this point 11 sons and one daughter. Daughter's name is Dinah, and there is an event, an encounter that takes place between her and a guy named Shechem, who is the prince of a town that's also named Shechem, and his father, he's the son of the head of the city. The head of the city's name is Hamor. And Hebrew and English don't always work the same way, and the world of the Bible is not our world, so it's not really clear whether Shechem raped her or seduced her. And that is an important question, absolutely. And there's, more lately been a lot of feminist writing about the question because the Torah seems totally uninterested in how Dinah feels about the whole thing. And that's important, but it's not relevant to what I'm planning to talk about. So I apologize for that. So what happens is that, Shechem is absolutely smitten with Dinah, and he goes to his father, Hamor, and says, you have to get her for me. I need to make her my wife. I'll die if I can't marry her. So Hamor goes to the brothers, and two of the brothers, Simeon and Levi, they say, we'll let her marry you on condition that our two peoples merge. Right? And we'll be one people, we'll be one nation, but of course that can't happen because we practice circumcision and you guys don't. Right? So if you all go ahead and get circumcised, and then Shechem can marry Dinah, and we'll be one big happy family. And the man says, good idea. And they get circumcised, and while they're recovering from the circumcision, Simeon and Levi swoop down on the town and kill all the men. Right? And this was their plan all along. Okay? And when Jacob finds out what Simeon and Levi did, he's not happy about it, okay? But the Torah text itself does not seem to take a clear position one way or another about what Simeon and Levi did. Jacob, in the context in chapter 34, is angry because he says basically, you've made me odious in the eyes of everybody around here, right? In other words, right, people will think that this is what we do, right? People will think this is what we do, this is the kind of people that we are, and nobody will trust us, and you've created a situation which is very dangerous for us. Simeon and Levi say, so we're supposed to allow our sister to be treated like a harlot. Right? And that's how the story ends. Okay? It does not take a clear position in its original context. Okay? Now, I think it will not surprise you to know that All right, so before I go on, I'm not sure even what question I want to ask. So I'll ask like a combined question. Was what Shimon and Levi did, was it right or wrong? And why? And like wedded to that or combined with that, what do you think the Jewish tradition says about what they did? Yeah, right.
From a militaristic standpoint, to me, it seems like you want to do something like that because they're easy pickings. You wait until they're convalescing, they're not going to be able to fight back, and then you go sack everything. But from a PR perspective, it's a massacre. And it doesn't
It's a what?
A massacre.
Right.
And it doesn't look good from that perspective. But, you know, I don't think it was necessarily the right thing to do. There could have been other ways to handle that. But, you know, from one perspective, you want an easy shot at these people?
Yeah, like it was certainly clever, right? I mean, it was clever at least at first impression, right? But this is always right. I mean, anybody else? Yeah, Dee.
I was thinking, from my point of view, what you said that being pejorative and not being pejorative, but being pejorative. And reading the passage, I didn't get a sense that this was people that had attacked us or were planning to attack us.
No, they hadn't.
So therefore, even more of a moral issue, why slaughter them?
Right, exactly. I mean, if they had just gone after Shechem, you could justify that, right? But they went after the whole town, or at least all of the men of the town, right? So they slaughtered non-combatants, right? They slaughtered non-combatants, which certainly contemporary law of war says you cannot intentionally kill non-combatants, right? Now, it is almost inevitable that in warfare, non-combatants might be killed, right? I mean, this is the whole argument about Gaza, right? I mean, it is very, very clear that thousands of non-combatants were killed, right? What is not clear, and I say this absolutely, it is not clear to me that Israel intentionally killed non-combatants, right? That is the charge that is claimed. To my mind, it has neither been proven nor refuted, right? But it is always the case that non-combatants are going to be killed, but you cannot intentionally target non-combatants, right? So there is no question in my mind that according to contemporary military ethics, what Shimon and Levi did was a war crime, right? That they, by intentionally massacring non-combatants, right? And Jacob, when you say PR and morality, now in chapter 34, Jacob doesn't say that what they did was wrong. He doesn't say that what they did was wrong. He says that what they did created a dangerous situation, right? Which is another reason for the laws of war. That is to say, if I tell my soldiers, go ahead and kill non-combatants, what is the result? The result is that the other side is going to feel free to target my non-combatants, right? That the laws of war exist not merely for moral reasons, but for pragmatic reasons, right? If everybody agrees that you don't target non-combatants, then that's the agreement, right? Now, not always observed, obviously, right? But that is, I think, part of the reason. And so here, Jacob does not say that what they did was wrong. He says what they did created a dangerous situation, right? And so I want to look at a medieval discussion of this issue, okay? And the main disagreement is between Maimonides, Rambam, and Nachmanides, Ramban, okay? And Maimonides says that what they did was absolutely right and justified, okay? And at first that may be somewhat surprising, but if you know Maimonides' position on the rights and responsibilities of non-Jewish governments, it's actually not that surprising, okay? So briefly, here's what Maimonides says, okay? Right, we know that there are the 7 Noahide commandments, right? There are 7 commandments that everybody is expected to observe, right? And one of those commandments is to have a legal system, okay? And so Maimonides says that by failing to punish Shechem, right, and all the men of the town knew what Shechem had done, and they failed to punish him, therefore they all are liable. They're all liable, and the entire town became complicit and liable for punishment. So Simeon and Levi were executing a divine law that the city had violated, okay? But Nachmanides says, no way, right? That yes, a non-Jewish government has an obligation to create a justice system, right? But nowhere does it say that the punishment for not having a functional justice system is death, right? Nowhere does it say that. And, they certainly, like if you have a crime and a failure to prosecute, so everybody in the town is liable for the death sentence because of that, right? The people of Shechem had done nothing to deserve death. They were innocent bystanders. And Simeon and Levi acted out of anger. And here's where, like I said, originally, Jacob doesn't say that what they did was wrong. He just says it created a dangerous situation. But on his deathbed, in chapter 49, he does say that. He says, cursed be their anger, for it was fierce. Right? And let my soul not be in their company, and I will disperse them among Israel, which actually is what happened, right? The tribe of Shimon was subsumed into another tribe, and the Levites, they don't have land. Right? They are the responsible for the temple, but they don't have land. Okay, so, Shimon becomes absorbed into the tribe of Judah, right? So, the dominant view in the tradition is that of Jacob in chapter 49, where it says what they did was wrong because they acted out of anger, right? And we know this, right? I mean, that parenting advice, right? Don't punish your kid, right? Your kid does something bad, right? Don't deal with it when you're angry, right? And I often tell people, somebody really made you angry, made you upset. Write them an angry email and keep it in your outbox for a couple of days. Right? Don't send it. After a couple of days, go back. You may not send it at all, or else you edit it. Right? But when you act out of anger, usually doesn't go well. Right? Usually doesn't go well. Right? So then the question is, how does this get translated into modern thought, right? And I know more about this in the IDF than I do about the U.S. military, because I didn't exactly serve in the IDF per se, but I lived on a kibbutz on the border for 2 years, and I was part of, it's called civil defense, okay? So I went through weapons training and so on and so forth, and one of the things that we had to learn are the rules of engagement, like, right, when is it legal to shoot at somebody, and when is it not legal to shoot at somebody. And in the IDF, they have a concept called Tohar HaNeshek, which means purity of arms. Purity of arms, okay, that arms are to be used. All right, so here's what the doctrine says. IDF soldiers will not use their weapons and force to harm human beings who are not combatants, and they will do all in their power to avoid causing harm to their lives, bodies, dignity, and property. Right? So if Shimon and Levi served in the IDF, they would have been court-martialed. They would have been court-martialed because they used their weapons against non-combatants, okay? And that's the key. In other words, you can certainly make a case as to why Shechem himself deserved execution, right? And certainly by biblical law, there's no question. Shechem himself deserved execution, but not the whole town, right? Not the whole town. You cannot kill non-combatants. You cannot wipe out an entire city to punish the actions of a few, right? And so I think, like I said, to me it is abundantly clear that if Shimon and Levi served in the IDF, they would have been court-martialed, and I presume the same, and Colonel Zapor would know better than me, but I would presume that Shimon and Levi would have been court-martialed had they served in the U.S. Army as well. Yeah? Right. So we don't have an idea of collective responsibility, right? And so Jacob's response in chapter 49 anticipates the strategic concern behind Tohar Haneshet, right? That the doctrine of purity of arms is not just moral, it's also pragmatic. It's to preserve the moral standing of the military, and more importantly, to prevent the degradation of the characters of the soldiers, right? And I have to say that, you know, to a lot, certainly of my friends, this is a real concern, right? I mean, if you see the way, certainly not all, but some settlers are really just going nuts in the West Bank, many would say that this is a natural consequence of the situation where you have 18, 19, 20-year-old kids serving essentially police actions against the hostile population, right? And I think this is also the concern about the use of the National Guard to patrol cities, right? I mean, what does it do to those young men and women, right? We have the concept of moral injury, right? That they are being sent to do things for which they are not trained, right? And which I'm quite certain many of them have doubts about whether what they're doing is necessary and proper, right? So the actions of Simeon and Levi created a moral stain as well as strategic blowback, right? And I remember when there was the debate in Israel over the judicial reform, right? That was one of the concerns. In other words, prior to that, the international community said the IDF has an internal system of justice which is trustworthy and reliable, right? And therefore, people who had served in the Israeli army traveled all over the world and were not concerned about whether they would be arrested, right? Because government said, IDF, you know, they have a JAG corps, they try, and they, you know, there certainly have been cases of soldiers being court-martialed and punished and so on and so forth. So we trust Israel to deal with this stuff properly, right? And a concern was that this would no longer be the case. And we see that. We see Israelis now sometimes afraid to travel, right? Am I going to be arrested? Am I going to be charged with war crimes? Again, I mean, legitimately or not legitimately is a whole other question, right? I mean, just like, you know, you can be a hypochondriac and also be sick, right? You can be paranoid and also have real enemies, right? I mean, Israel can be unfairly and anti-Semitically subjected to anti-Semitism and unfair critiques and still also have done wrong, right? I mean, both of these things can coexist, right? So the concept of purity of arms requires the soldier to reject that impulse to act out of anger, so that even in the face of a heinous crime, the moral line between the guilty and the innocent must never be erased, right? And so I want to close with anybody other than me familiar with the name Eli Geva? Eli Geva? I didn't think so. All right. Eli Geva was the youngest, up until that time, the youngest colonel in the history of the IDF. Right? He was a full colonel at the age of 32. And he was during the Lebanon War in 82, the first Lebanon War. And he was the commander of the battalion that was supposed to conquer West Beirut. And they were waiting outside the city, waiting, and he had two concerns. He said, first of all, I know that if we conquer West Beirut, I am going to lose soldiers, right? And I believe that this is unnecessary. There's no military necessity to this action that I'm going to be ordered to perform. And then how am I supposed to, after the battle is over, go to the parents of my soldiers and tell them that their kid was killed in an action that I considered unnecessary? But the other thing he said, I stand on this hill and I look through my binoculars at Beirut and I see children. And I see children, and I know, how am I supposed to give an order that is going to result in the death of these children? So what he sought to do was, he didn't want to abandon his men, but he didn't want to be the one to give that order either. So he said, can I step down from my command? Let me be a medic. Let me be a medic, okay? And the army said no. And they relieved him of his command, and they kicked him out of the army. And there was at the time a huge debate. I mean, was he right? Was he wrong? Was he a hero? Was he a coward? And again, I mean, the opinions were all over the place, right? But this idea, I will say this, right? I was just following orders, right? Now, I want to be clear, that does not mean that a simple soldier questions every order that they receive, right? I mean, both the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the IDF doctrine says that a soldier should not follow an order which is clearly illegal. Right? And that's the word, clearly illegal. Okay, and then if you look in the Navy's manual, it says explicitly, firing on shipwrecked people is a clearly illegal order. Okay, so I was just following orders. It wasn't an excuse at Nuremberg. It wasn't an excuse at Milan. It's not an excuse in the IDF. It's not an excuse when the order is clearly illegal, right? And we depend on the idea that people have sufficient training to understand when an order is clearly illegal. Okay, and so so in terms of Eli Geva, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that the orders that he received were clearly illegal. Right? In retrospect, they turned out to be disastrous, but that's a different issue. But certainly what Shimon and Levi did was clearly illegal, and Jacob's critique was both moral and pragmatic. Comments, questions? All right, Shabbat Shalom. We got a minute, right?
But I have to be cold after you.
Okay, so, all right.
So I have to just do first stage 9.
Okay, well, I mean, all right, hold on a second. Let me turn this off.